Welcome to everyone tuning in tonight on Zoom and on Facebook. My name is Libby Davies, and I'm the co-host of Off the Hill, rabble.ca's political commentary panel discussion. Off the Hill addresses current issues of national significance from a progressive and a critical viewpoint. I'm very glad to be here tonight with our panelists, Karl Nerenberg, Rabble's award-winning political correspondent. Hello, Karl. Nice to see you back. Leah Gazan, Member of Parliament for Winnipeg Centre. Hi, Leah. And our special guest, Cindy Blackstock, who is the Executive Director of the First Nations Family and Caring Society. You'll also get to hear from my alternating co-host of Off the Hill, Robin Brown. Hi, Robin, at the end of tonight's panel. So let's get right to it because we don't have a lot of time. For those of you watching on Zoom, you can participate in the chat or ask questions to our panelists through the Q&A function, and we'll certainly do our best to address your questions. For those of you watching on Facebook, welcome to you. So to begin tonight, the disturbing news earlier this month of the remains of 215 children at the Kamloops Indian Residential School was described as, quote, an unthinkable loss that was spoken about but never documented by the Kamloops Indian Residential School. And that was said by Chief Rosanne Casimir. Since then, the numbers have been growing with reports not only from Kamloops, but from Brandon, Regina, Lestock, and we know that this is just the beginning. The knowledge of the tragic fate of these young children has resulted in ongoing grief, pain, trauma, and suffering for the affected families and communities. Residential school survivors from every community have been affected, and a national debate has been sparked with the broader public. There is a reckoning to be had as the magnitude of the horrendous history of Canada's violent colonial settler past is exposed. I think it's fair to say that everyone is wanting answers. Indigenous peoples have been very clear that thoughts, emotions, prayers, and expressions of sympathy from government leaders is disingenuous if not based on a record of concrete action for reconciliation and a recognition of the calls for land back. Each of us as settlers has this responsibility. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission, led by Justice Murray Sinclair, tabled its historic report and 94 calls to action in December 2015. The calls to action have not been implemented. 6 of those recommendations specifically addressed missing children and burial grounds. You know, it's hard not to be cynical when the Trudeau government expresses sympathy for the children and their families while continuing to appeal the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal decision ordering Ottawa to compensate First Nations children. I'd like to start today with a question to you, Cindy. But first of all, let me say thank you for your deep and unwavering commitment for justice for Indigenous children. I know you've been back in federal court again this week to fight for the rights of Indigenous children. And so I think we'll begin by asking you if you could give us an update of how this past week went at the court hearing.
For your listeners, in 2016, the Canadian government was found to be racially discriminating against First Nations children by underfunding child welfare in such a way that it was driving First Nations children into care at higher rates than residential school. And the other thing that was discriminatory is Canada was not applying something called Jordan's Principle to make sure that First Nations children had access to the public services they need when they needed them. The government paraded out some ministers, they welcomed the decision, and then they didn't comply. So it is now 5 years later. We've had 19 non-compliance and procedural orders against the Canadian government and counting. And this week, the federal government was challenging 2 of the orders that the tribunal made. The first was to compensate the children that Canada willfully and recklessly discriminated against. And what I mean by that, Libby, is the tribunal found really clear evidence that Canada knew that these kids were being treated unequally, knew that that was driving family separations unnecessarily, and decided not to do anything about it, had solutions and didn't act. And the result of that is thousands of unnecessary family separations at a greater scale than residential school, harms to children who are denied services, and tragically, the deaths of children. The tribunal awarded $40,000 in compensation. That's not a lot of money. These are human rights damages. That's the most they can award under the Act, which is something I'm hoping Leah's going to take up in Parliament and revise. But Canada doesn't want to pay that. So Canada is arguing this week. They're saying, well, you know, it's not okay for a child who was in care for what they called 3 quiet nights away from their families. I don't know if they've ever seen a child welfare removal, but I have, and they would never describe it that way. They said that child doesn't deserve the same as other children. And I said, well, $40,000 is the floor, and if you want to give more than that, you can do it. The other thing they're challenging, though, Libby, is Jordan's principle for First Nations children who do not have Indian Act status. As you know, that racist Indian Act was a piece of legislation Canada relied upon to push children into residential schools. It's still on the books. And Canada says, we only want to help First Nations children who have that racist Indian Act status. And guess who controls the definition of who is and who is not status? The Canadian government. We reject that. So in my view, I think that the evidence is really clear. Canada has relied on a lot of rhetoric, and we reply with the evidence and with the rulings. And I think Canada's arguments are very weak, and I think that they're collapsing under the weight of the truth. We'll have to see what the federal court does, but it's really, really critical that everybody keeps watching this case, because every time in history when we've had a crisis in First Nations, Métis, or Inuit communities, and the public emotions rise and then they look away, the injustices continue by this federal state. We have to keep watching until the injustice stops.
Thank you so much, Cindy, for that update. I can imagine that it would have been a very intense week that you've just come through this week in the federal court. And I think having that update helps bring us to the central question that we are wanting to address today. You know, that this issue that the federal government is fighting against basic principles of justice, not only in the court case that you're involved in, but also the fact that the federal government has failed in its responsibility to uncover the truth and scope of the number of children lost and where they are buried, as clearly called for in the TRC report. Now, Leah, you're a very strong and principled voice for Indigenous rights within Parliament and within the community. You've been calling for attention and action, and I have no doubt that it comes with personal grief and pain. And so I kind of like reach out to you, you know, that's really hard, what you're going through and many people are going through. I do want to ask you if you feel that progress is being made, given the fact that the unanimous motion was adopted, the NDP motion on June the 8th, calling on the federal government to stop fighting Indigenous children in court and to implement the TRC's calls to action. Are we making progress, or are we just at a standstill?
Well, you know, I have to clarify what unanimous means. I mean, the Prime Minister didn't show up. Deputy Prime Minister Freeland didn't show up. All the ministers abstained from the vote. That's a very clear message that we know exactly what we're doing and we're going to keep doing it. Before I start, though, I have to give a shout out. It's good to see you, Libby, Karl, and I have to give props to one of my greatest heroes, Cindy, and all the work that you're doing before I do my regular complaining about the failures of government. But no, I mean, I think that was a really clear message. You know, I was pushing the government after the discovery of children around the residential schools. We knew that. Like, everybody was so shocked. We knew that. It was in the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. I've seen so many privileged tears from all parties, you know, across the country since the news, but has it resulted in action? I would say absolutely not. We see what's going on in Wet'suwet'en territory, for example, Site C Dam, Muskrat Falls. It was all rooted for the same reason, and part of that was to kidnap our children and take them off to residential schools so they could advance their economic agenda. It's the same fight. And at the top of it, it's continued. You know, our good friend here, Cindy Blackstock, has been fighting for years with sorry excuses from the government. And when I asked the government point blank several times, opposition party members, the federal government, to acknowledge what happened in residential school as genocide, the same kind of genocide they acknowledged in the National Inquiry into Murdered and Missing Indigenous Women and Girls. It's not historical, it's ongoing. We see it as a continuation in our child welfare system. They refuse to answer, or they deny it. And I want to read this article because I think it's really telling. Article 2 on the UN Convention on Genocide is very clear. It reads as follows. In the present convention, genocide means any of the following acts committed with the intent to destroy in whole or in part a national, ethnical, racial, or religious group as such. And there's 5 main criteria. A, killing members of a group. B, causing seriously bodily or mental harm to members of the group. C, deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part. D, imposing measures intended to prevent births within the group. And we know even today, there's ongoing sterilization of Indigenous women. E, forcibly transferring children of the group to another group. This is very clear. Yet when I ask these questions, there's denial. We will never reconcile in this country if we don't have the truth. And this government and governments, whether provincial or federal across this country, still deny the truth and continue to perpetuate genocide on Indigenous peoples.
Well, I think Leah and Cindy, you've both really hit it square on. And that is that we're facing this huge disconnect between words, pious words, and deeds, actions. And so both in the court case that you're involved in, Cindy, and Leah, I know on June the 10th, you moved a motion seeking unanimous consent in the House to recognize these acts of genocide, and it was not approved. But I think, you know, that's really part of the central question that we're getting at here today. And I want to bring Karl in because, Karl, you wrote just a very interesting article recently on rabble.ca, reminding us of 25 years ago, the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples and the groundbreaking recommendations that of course were shelved, and again, empty words from government and nothing that was actually followed through. So it really is the question here that I think we're all grappling with, and we want answers. How do we get beyond the words? And how do we get to demonstrative, concrete, meaningful action from the government in partnership with First Nations of this country? So Karl, just any thoughts you have on that?
So I was very happy to hear Leah talk about the economic dimension. I mean, there's a huge links between the overarching relationship between the, you know, our settler colonial society and Indigenous peoples and the particular massacres and scandals and tragedies that we talk about in terms of residential schools or in terms of the treatment of children in the child welfare system. Those aren't just bad things that happened in isolation. Those aren't just mistakes that we made in the framework of an otherwise benign policy. Those are part and parcel, as Leah said, of a policy that we had since the first settlers and the first so-called explorers came here, which is that we wanted to take control of the territory and its resources to make profits for ourselves and for our businesses, and the Indigenous people were in the way. And that's really what's behind it. I think, you know, when you all you people, you 100-odd people listening to this, and I'm not here to give you advice, and many of you know more about all these issues than I do, But when you think about what you can do, I think to some extent it's to inform yourselves as much as possible about, by going back to such seminal documents as the Royal Commission of 1996, or reading the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in detail. It's a bit of reading. It's actually good. I tell you, that Royal Commission makes pretty good reading. It's actually powerfully written. But also engaging with your neighbors, engaging with your family. I find myself often having to talk to people, well, don't all these Indigenous people, aren't their communities all corrupt? Don't they get all this money from government? Can't they just go to university free? How come they don't have to pay taxes? Why should they get, don't they get all these big settlements and all this money? Aren't we spending so much money on them all the time? You have to arm yourself to confront these arguments. And I'll just say one last thing. We're going to have an election federally very soon. Last time, going back to the first time the Tribunal Liberals ran, they did very well with Indigenous people. They count on getting in votes of Indigenous people. They try to narrowcast and talk to Indigenous communities to help win a few ridings. You've got to make those issues your issues, even if you're not Indigenous. You've got to make their issues your issues, and you got to make sure the politicians are forced to address them in Toronto and Montreal and Vancouver, not just on Indigenous reserves.
I think that's a good suggestion, Karl, that if with the possible federal election that we make this the issue in terms of local ridings, candidates that are running. I just want to briefly go back to Cindy. Cindy, I saw that you put something in the chat about an action that your nephew took. Do you want to share that? I just read it so quickly. So
well, that was for Leah. But what I would say about actions that people can do,
yes,
what's really important is just building on Karl's point. On every election, I actually have a copy of the TRC calls to action at my door, as well as the Spirit Bear plan to end all the inequalities in First Nations public services. And I get the old rap at the door and, can we count on you for your vote? And I said, that depends. Tell me, what do you know of these two things? Mm-hmm. That's what it's going to take for all of us. And the other piece that I find it's really kind of toxic in the dialogue in Ottawa is there's lots of phraseology about this being a historic dark chapter. And that's a way of not accepting accountability for the current wrongdoing. Mm-hmm. They don't want to face up to reality that, for example, they have been found racially discriminating against 165,000 kids, that their non-compliance has been linked to the deaths of children in 2018. This isn't history. This is happening right now. I remember one of the kids who came to the tribunal, Libby, you remember the room was always full of kids, the courtroom. And he said, you know, the funny thing about history is you're always living it. You just don't always think about it. Mm-hmm. And so we are living history. And the question is, like, there's so much evidence, as Leah said, just on the table about what the problems are, but more importantly, getting to Karl's point and Leah's, what the solutions are. And the government isn't moving on it. So that means we, the people, must do it. When the governments don't create change, we have to put them in a position where they respond to change.
Mm-hmm. And we've certainly seen our capacity and ability to do that on many other issues. So we've got to take this on in this election particularly. And even if there isn't election, I think this is something we have to press home and make it clear to all elected representatives or people who want to be elected, that unless they face this squarely, not just as an historic question, but as an action to now be resolved, then, you know, they're not going to get the support from people. So it's a very important point. Just Leah, back to you. I know that Parliament is I'm not sure if it is actually wrapped up at this point. I know you had some votes today, but you know, we get into the summer days, and it's, you know, people are on holiday and the media isn't paying as much attention. Maybe there will be more because of a possible election, but just thoughts that you have about what we all can do to keep pressing on this issue. I know you'll be out there very actively, but any thoughts that you have about how people can support you?
Well, I don't think it's really about me. I think it's about all of us. And, just building on what Cindy shared, movements are powerful. Yesterday, the Senate passed Bill C-15 in the House, for example, which was built off of Romeo Saganash's Bill C-262 with expert amendments that came out of the study. That wasn't because the government really wanted to pass it. That's because thousands and thousands and thousands of people across the country, first of all, pushed Bill C 262 to be passed through Parliament, to be defeated at the time by an unelected Senate, 5 senators in particular, but pushed it through. They know that their support of it will impact them politically. And I think, currently we have our good friend Cindy, who has spent years fighting to have the government uphold the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal ruling. We need to provide the same sort of force behind that current effort. I told a funny story, actually. When I was in university, I had this professor. He was an early schools teacher or early years teacher, and every time we were talking class and he wanted to get our attention, he'd say, "Open your listening ears, open your listening ears." And so we would laugh, and we started calling him Mr. Listening Ears. Oh, Mr. Listening Ears wants our attention. And I think, in terms of allyship with Indigenous people, it's actually not about having the answers. We have the answers. It's about listening and walking with us side by side to push forward justice that still is not realized in this country, justice where our minimum human rights are up for debate every day in the House that I sit in. We cannot forget that is the place where everybody voted in favor of this dirty old Indian Act that they don't want to get rid of. It's the same sort of violent, colonial, misogynistic, racist environment even today. And so we need people on the ground pushing people on the inside to do the right thing, even when they don't want to do the right thing, so that we can build a place where all of us can live in dignity. And I think that is actually not about us. It's about the movement pushing people on the inside. I think it's more about people on the outside than in fact it is about people that hold positions with title and power.
Mm-hmm. Well, certainly that sense of unity and alliance and solidarity is going to be very important as we move forward on this issue. And Cindy, I sure hope that the court case that you've been involved in has a conclusion and that it doesn't keep dragging on. I mean, it's incredible the number of years that you've had to keep at it. And I know that's just one element of this much bigger question of reconciliation and land back and justice for Indigenous people. I think we're going to move to some questions because there's quite a few questions coming in. The first question has to do with the Marshall decision, that the Mi'kmaq of the Maritime do have the treaty rights to fish. And the question is, do you think that will ever be adhered to, and the Department of Fisheries and Oceans will ever treat the fishers fairly and protect treaty rights? So that's one question that's come in. A second question is from someone who wants to know if the passing of C-15 and the implementation of UNDRIP will support any of these efforts. Is it window dressing or a meaningful action on the part of the Crown? So I don't know, like Cindy, do you want to respond to one of those questions, or Leah? And then I'll ask Karl to jump in.
I'll take on Marshall and just to start the debate. My view is no, they won't. Not until the public demands that the government of Canada follows the law. I mean, I've got legal orders to order them to stop racially discriminating in what are apartheid public services against little kids, and the government isn't complying. And when we look at lots of Supreme Court orders where the government does not comply, it skates above the law. And the reason it can do that is because it is protected in many ways by statute, so you can't go against the government. It's also the largest law firm in Canada. And most importantly, it's because the public doesn't keep up the pressure. So they can get away with it. And I think that until that changes, until we have something like akin to the civil rights movement, really, where people understand that it is the state discriminating against First Nations people through the Indian Act. And just to clarify, the Indian Act does not apply to Métis or Inuit, but they have different forms of discrimination. But, you know, like, this is what we need to kind of have happen. Otherwise, no, they won't. In my view, I think it's highly unlikely. The best predictor of future behavior is past behavior, and we can see what they've done in the past.
Well, we can see that from your court case, where the federal government just basically poo-pooed a decision of the Human Rights Tribunal, and here you are, what, 10 years later or more, still fighting that decision. So yeah, Leah, any response or comment on the questions?
Well, just going back to what Cindy shared, I absolutely agree with her, and go back to the importance of people power, like that we need to keep the pressure up. I don't think we can count on the intention of government. I think we know what the intention of government is. We have to keep the intention up on. In terms of C-15, this bill just affirms the application of UNDRIP in Canadian law, something that's already been affirmed through the Supreme Court. And again, it goes back to people. Now it's up to people to hold the government accountable, to uphold those minimum human rights that are part of the articles, that form part of the articles of UNDRIP. I think we see what's happening in BC with the BC provincial government. Again, they passed UNDRIPA. So there's two issues here. One is the piece of legislation, which just affirms something that was, already affirmed through the Supreme Court, that it has application in Canadian law, along with other, others like treaties, Indigenous law, international law. I don't think it will change anything, but it's up to people to put pressure on the government to uphold it. So, I often talk about movements. I think we're at a critical juncture. I think that, education, people know better since the TRC, for example. They know better since the National Inquiry into Murdered and Missing Indigenous Women and Girls. And now we need a movement. We need a movement to pressure governments to do the right thing, to uphold human rights, and to ensure that all Indigenous people throughout the country can live with human rights and dignity, including children. The very children that Cindy Blackstock has been fighting for 10 years.
I think it really comes down to the question of building in mechanisms in some of these reports for accountability. I remember that was an issue in BC for the Missing and Murdered Women's Opal Commission. And I remember speaking myself about saying we couldn't just have another report that would just sit on a shelf, that building in actual accountability mechanism, forcing the government to account and to follow through. And Karl, the article that you wrote recently in Rabble, looking at the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples, you noted some very interesting mechanisms for accountability, such as Indigenous, earmarked Indigenous seats in Parliament, such as they have in New Zealand for Maori people. There was also, I think, a recommendation for a parallel Indigenous assembly, and that indigeneity would be built into the processes of Parliament, into decision making. I think that's very interesting. I mean, that was 25 years ago that those kinds of ideas were put forward. Where are they now? Do they, is it on anybody's mind these days?
And what is sad about that is the government of the time, was the Chrétien government, basically ducked the entire thing, because to them it meant mean reopening the Constitution. Because the fact is, the provinces have a lot of say in our country. The provinces control natural resources on their territory, and natural resources are in many ways at the nub of the issue. As we talk about social services, we talk about schools, we talk about the mistreatment of people, the underlying economic interests are really what's at the heart here, and the provinces have a big say. So, I mean, even if we grant the federal government the position, okay, to start taking on the provinces on the issues of natural resources, the federal government could make an effort. They could start. There was one election in Saskatchewan a few elections back when Brad Wall was still premier. And at that time, I'm not going to praise one party or the other, but the NDP leader there said, it's time we started sharing natural resource revenue with the Indigenous people of Saskatchewan. And Brad Wall used these pious statements, oh, the revenue is for all Saskatchewaners and all this kind of nonsense. And, I know that people here and some people watching us know more about this than I do. In the case of the James Bay Agreement of Quebec, highly imperfect, but there is a case where you actually have royalties from hydroelectric development going directly to Indigenous people, where you have a territory-wide self-government institutions rather than tiny little weak bands. So there are things that one can do. But what you mentioned, institutions of the federal government, the changes required don't need the provinces. The federal government is the mistress or master or in charge of its own affairs. If the federal government wanted to create seats for Aboriginal people, even if all the provinces thought it was a terrible idea, too bad. Not your business. We can do that. They can change that. They could reorganize. There are certain basic rules they have to apply, certain number of seats or certain. Prince Edward Island, they're wonderful people at Prince Edward Island. They are the size of one riding in Vancouver, Toronto, with 4 members and 4 senators, and they get that guaranteed until perpetuity. And there isn't a single seat guaranteed for more than 1 million Aboriginal people. Many, many more Aboriginal people than the people of Prince Edward. God bless the people of Prince Edward, and I love them. It's a wonderful place, beautiful beaches, and we don't want them to be left out. And we feel we have to make an accommodation with those people, but there's nothing whatsoever. And we had the horrible, tragic case of a member from Nunavut having to say, I got to get out of this place. I don't belong here. I'm not treated well. If we had institutionalized Indigenous participation in the federal government, that would change the atmosphere there. The security guards might come to realize, hey, an Indigenous person actually is a member of Parliament.
Well, as is often the case, Karl, and I think as each of you has outlined, there's no lack of solution and resolution. It's out there. It's within the Indigenous community. It's there in a legal framework. It's there in these commission reports. It's in the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And it's interesting because quite a few of the questions that are coming in are coming back to this question. For example, we have one from Lynn who says, what are some of the concrete tactics we can use during an election to hold candidates' feet to the fire? So I think the nub of it here is, we know what needs to be done. The question is, how do we do it? How do we get it to happen? And how do we seize the opportunity of possibly an election? What concrete things can we do? I think that's very much on people's minds. Any sort of concrete ideas from people in terms of how it might play out in local ridings and what people can do with local candidates?
Well, we have 7 free ways to make a difference in under 2 minutes on our website for First Nations kids. And we really encourage people to print out the Spirit Bearer Plan, which is like all these the federal government makes the choice to underfund all public services on reserve. That's why you see water. You like water, no water, right? And we need the public pressure for the federal government to provide that equity. Equity is actually in social sciences the closest thing we have to a silver bullet. If we reduce those inequalities, we'll see reductions in children in care, reductions of youth who are incarcerated, reductions of mental health concerns, reductions of addictions, increase in physical health. All that flows from reducing inequality. So we have to do that, and the Spirit Bearer Plan was passed by the Chiefs and Assembly to do it. Here's the other thing. We have to challenge ourselves to really catch the stereotypes that the feds put out to us. Number one, they say it's too complex. But governments do complex things all the time, Libby. And one thing I noticed is while they were fighting these First Nations kids in court, they were negotiating a trade agreement with that nutcase in the White House. Never once did they say that was too complex, or we might have to put that off for 5 or 6 years or move our deadline back because this is just too difficult, right? They can be a can-do kind of stuff. Look at CERB. Look at all the money they were spraying around in the pandemic. Now, I support that, but that makes me wonder, where was the money when First Nations kids needed a good school to go to? Where was the money when kids needed clean water? Where was the money when kids needed to be able to stay safely in their families? These are deliberate choices that the government makes. And we must not allow the use of the word failure. It's not a failure. It's a conscious choice that feeds into, as Karl has pointed out, this bigger narrative. And we have to start unpacking that, and we have to hold our politicians accountable to it.
Yeah, I sure remember, Cindy, when the then Minister Chrystia Freeland was down in Washington, D.C. almost every day, lobbying and courting and, coaching and advocating. And yes, you're absolutely right. When there's a decision to take it on, it absolutely can be done, as we've seen even with the pandemic, with a lot of pushing from the NDP to make some of the provisions a lot better. So it is a question of really kind of scapegoating and fooling the public that somehow this can't be done. It's too big a deal. Either Leah or Karl, anything you want to weigh in on before we go to the next question?
I just want to say quickly, sorry, Leah, but the government did, going back to that Royal Commission, the Trudeau government did implement one particular recommendation of that Royal Commission, which is to split the Ministry of what used to be called Indian Affairs and Aboriginal Affairs, and now Indigenous Affairs, into two. Into the Crown Indigenous relationship and into the services. That goes back. That was actually they could do that one because, of course, that was a shuffling the deck chairs on the Titanic kind of thing. That was, a cabinet move. So, but if they could do that, then they can do a lot more. And sadly, you get a sense of where their mind really is at the same time, Trudeau created a Minister for Middle Class Prosperity. But when he says middle class, does he mean Indigenous people? How many Indigenous people consider themselves part of the middle class? I rest my case.
Well, if I remember correctly, the minister refused to define the middle class. Leah?
No, that just to weigh in, I think, it's about political will. And I think there's been a normalization in this country in terms of discrimination against Indigenous people. It's normalized racism in this country. So discussions about incremental justice around basic human rights like providing access to clean drinking water have become a normal conversation where outside of, for example, First Nations communities, we wouldn't be having this discussion. If there was apartment buildings in major cities that all of a sudden didn't have clean drinking water and all of a sudden didn't have toilets, there would be an outcry. But there's a normalized racism in this country, and it's rooted in history. And it's rooted in the foundations of this place that we now call Canada, which was built on the wrongful dispossession and genocide of Indigenous people and ongoing genocide, which is why you see things like in Wet'suwet'en territory, where RCMP are given permission to use lethal force and have sniper guns ripping people off their very own lands. I mean, let's not forget reserves. That's not our territory.
Mm-hmm.
That is not our territory. I mean, one just has to look at the James Bay Cree. If you look at Northern Quebec is James Bay Cree territory.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So when there's political will to uphold human rights, it can be done. But there's a normalization of discrimination in this country that needs to end.
Yeah. I wonder if there's also an opportunity to work from the bottom up. I mean, we focused a lot on the federal government, and they have the major fiduciary responsibility. But I think it's interesting that municipalities, even NGOs, are looking at indigenization. They're looking at active ways for reconciliation. I know that's happened even here in our city of Vancouver. And I think that's another way that people can help get connected and create the pressure from the bottom up to put pressure on the federal government. Okay, and yeah, one of the questions that's come in is, Leah, the recent speech from the member from Iqaluit, who really just it was a devastating comments about her experience in the House of Commons and the racism that she encountered and the fact that she did not feel like she belonged. How do we begin to tackle that even within the institution of Parliament, so that, you know, we talk about diversity, we talk about Indigenous representation, but if the place isn't even welcoming, and I know you've spoken about this before, then that's something that is a major problem, because why would anyone even want to run in that kind of situation?
So when I ran to become a member of Parliament, I knew what I was signing up for. You know, and it's going back to denial. Like, denial is a form of violence. Like the fact that I put forward a unanimous consent motion, you know, outlining genocide, and it was denied. Denial is another form of violence, just like denying the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal ruling that's been, you know, ruled in favor of 50. That's violent. Until we reconcile the truth in this country, and remember, the House of Commons and people elected are a reflection of the values that have been taught in this country. Until we reconcile the truth in this country, until we have truth, we're not going to have reconciliation. So I think representation does matter. However, you know, I'm not saying that, you know, I think I don't want to make it about me. I think this is way bigger than me. But, you know, me taking a seat in the House, I'm taking up space. I'm giving voice to issues that probably otherwise wouldn't be discussed. I'm pushing the agenda on specific items that, you know, we wash over on all political stripes. Let's be honest here. Like, let's get to the truth here. There's a normalized racism that has happened in this country that has been upheld by people in positions of power, full stop, in all parties. And until we are truthful, it will continue to be that violent place. But here's the thing. We also have the power to change it. And I think more important than people that are elected to sit in that place is a place that I spent my whole life, and that's boots to ground. It's the voices on the ground speaking truth and forcing those who have the privilege to make decisions to do the right things. And this goes beyond values. It's just upholding human rights. It's human rights that we've all agreed upon upholding.
Yeah,
that's still not happening.
Yep, and we've talked a lot today about what people can do, and just everyone can check out the chat, because we've been listing the resources that you've mentioned in the chat line, so people can go and look at that, and also to look at it during the rebroadcast. Unfortunately, that's all the time we have for questions today, and so I would like to thank our panelists, Karl, Leah, and our special guest, Cindy Blackstock. You guys have been really, really helpful today in this very significant and important conversation. So before we go, I'm going to turn over the last word to my co-host, Robin Brown. So Robin, over to you.
Thank you so much, Libby. That was a very powerful discussion. Thank you to all the panelists. I wish we could do it all again next month, but we're going to take a summer break. But Off the Hill will be back at the end of the summer, and we want to know what topics you'd like us to focus on in upcoming panels. So share your comments and ideas on our Facebook page, and stay connected by signing up to our free weekly email and news alerts at rabble.ca/alerts. Thank you all for joining us tonight. Have a great summer, and we look forward to seeing you next time.
Thanks, everyone. Have a great summer.